Want it or not, the schools are about to reopen. The decision to reopen our schools is a hard one, hinging on the balance of four important values: educational, social, and emotional needs of children to be with other children, personal safety and health of children and staff, economic impact of ongoing school closure, and personal liberty to determine one's fate and its balance towards public health. Any sound reopening policy needs to consider these four factors, and as many districts are leaning towards hybrid models, a new choice arises. Do we send the kids back to school, or do we keep them remote learning at home? Let's take a look at the factors involved. It is no accident that the American Academy of Pediatrics strongly advocates for physical school opening. Zoom classes will never do learning justice, and the children need social interaction, not distancing, to grow. I'm no expert, but I wholeheartedly agree with the notion of distance learning detriment. We just need to put it in a broader context. In a word, no. Guarantee is a big word, and it is important for us parents to understand that the schools will do their best to mitigate the risk of spread, but never be able to guarantee anything. Our reopening plans rely on one core assumption, that the virus spreads via what we call a droplet respiratory route, using heavy droplets from coughs and sneezes as a vehicle of contagion. These are the droplets that can be stopped by masks and which do not travel beyond 6 feet. As you may have heard in the news, there are now literally hundreds of scientists who dispute that assumption and point to a far more infectious route via what we call aerosol or airborne spread, a way for the virus to spread through unventilated indoor environments far beyond the original 6 feet radius. The issue is far from being settled, but it is very possible. The implications are serious. It means that no matter how much we space the kids apart in classrooms, and no matter how strict we are about the masks, the risks of viral spread cannot be reduced to zero. The kids will mingle in the halls, will walk through each other's 6-foot personal spaces on their way to their desks, will surely relish in each other's company, laugh, talk, and not always remember to keep the masks on. As a result, if a single child brings the virus into the school, the virus will spread, and there's really nothing we can do about it. All of our efforts to sanitize, to demand masks, to erect partitions between desks will reduce the risk, but never to zero. And whereas it is possible for outside policymakers to accept a small risk of infection for the greater good, the calculus does change when your own kids are involved. This line of thinking is backed by recently released CDC documents which call indoor school environments the highest risk for spread of the virus. Still, CDC allows for reopening, so what gives? You need to know how to read between the lines of the official recommendations by the big organizations such as WHO and CDC. The implications of designating the virus airborne are staggering, and those organizations are under pressure to issue recommendations that are practical to implement in their respective jurisdictions. This happens all over the world and depends on circumstances. In America, we ask for 6 feet, for example, while in more densely populated Peru, their health agencies ask for 1 meter or 3 feet. Not that Peruvian agencies do not think 6 feet are better, but because they know 6 feet is impossible, and if they ask for the moon, people just throw their hands in the air and do nothing. And since 3 feet is better than nothing, 3 feet it is. So, as you can see, the public health recommendations are always predicated on overall situation, and it pays to follow the trends in the underlying scientific debate to see where they will go next. We went from no masks to masks for everyone in the span of 3 months because the science has changed, and I think it is changing again. WHO is already softening the stance towards the airborne spread, and we may get there before this whole thing is over. As such, this virus likely stays in there longer and spreads further than we currently acknowledge, and is a real threat in an unventilated classroom. So, we either invest in state-of-the-art airflow machines in each schoolroom, or accept the fact that an asymptomatic infected kid in row F is going to spread it to his friends 6 feet or not. Which brings me to the second crucial point. They believe that kids do not get sick. Taking aside the risk to other school workers, such as teachers, principals, maintenance workers, etc., the risk to children is real as well. Our initial impression out of China was that COVID mortality among children was essentially non-existent, and so I personally believed that our kids were safe from it. We now understand that although serious COVID disease is rare in children, it does occur and thus no kid is 100% safe. A new inflammatory disease called multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, or MIS-C for short, was described in New York City and caught my attention. It is very rare, with only 100 cases described so far. It also does not seem to be that deadly. Vast majority of the kids recover, but that is only after they receive massive doses of steroids, which have long-term side effects by themselves and with significant problems. You see, MIS-C attacks blood vessels, which means that many of the recovered kids can still suffer from lifelong heart and aortic complications, most notably coronary artery aneurysms. So although these children do not die to make the headlines, many of them do suffer long-term consequences of the virus. What's worse, MIS-C comes up to 2 months after the initial, usually mild bout of the virus, a consequence of child's immune system overreacting and slowly turning on the child's own blood vessels, skin, and intestines. This means that in the event of virus resurgence in the school system, followed by the decision to close down again, it will still take 2 months to know that any particular child is in the clear. As New York cleared its virus, the MIS-C cases disappeared from our view, but it will likely come back from the southern states soon. In fact, the first cases were already identified in the Carolinas, and it will only get worse, I believe. I cannot sit here and pretend that the economic considerations have no role in the reopening. As medical workers, we are at increased risk of infection, but at least we have a job. Many people can work remotely from home, but many cannot, and ultimately the ability to drop a kid in school to go and learn a living is a crucial component here. Add to this the great disparity in quality of internet education across districts, the need for certain children to be fed at school, and a documented increase in child abuse as some parents just can't take this anymore, and all of these issues tip the scale towards opening. Also, we cannot ignore the core American value of personal liberty and self-determination, which may play a role in some parents' demand for the districts to reopen. All these factors play an important role here, and none should be discounted offhand. So, in the end, we will need to make this difficult decision on our own terms. How do you weigh education, economic needs, and personal liberty of hundreds of children in a district versus health dangers to a precious few? It is a deeply personal decision, different from the perspective of a policymaker and different from the position of the parent, for whom even a tiny risk of serious infection in a child is simply unacceptable. And so, we will do our best to apply our own circumstances, anxieties, and value systems to make the decision. Our schools will do their best to protect the children, but all parties involved need to be ready for the following likely scenario. Social distancing, half-capacity days, disinfection protocols will all help. However, if the virus is present in the community, it will enter the school. September will likely pass without incident, and we will relax a little. 6 weeks into a school year, however, the first cases will start to pop up. We'll get emails stating a child or two have been diagnosed with the virus. The school may close for a few days, but it will likely resist a full shutdown yet. Once that happens, the rest will play out like it did everywhere else, from Wuhan to Westchester. Discovery of the first case would mean significant asymptomatic spread in the school. Dozens of children will be diagnosed in the following 2 weeks, and the school will close. By that time, we will all frantically check on our own kids' temperatures and take them to their pediatricians with the slightest cough. MIS-C takes up to 2 months to develop, so even the healthy-looking infected children will not be out of the woods until Thanksgiving, and the parents of these kids will spend those 2 months in varied levels of anxiety. I want to emphasize that this scenario is not inevitable, especially in the states with a low local transmission at this time. It is a guess, but an educated one. And then there's also some hope. Many countries reopened schools in the past few months, and the results are generally encouraging. Take Finland and Sweden, for example. As we know, Sweden never closed its schools, while neighboring Finland did. The child infection rates from both countries were compared, and it seems that closure or not of schools had no measurable impact on the number of infections in either country. In other words, Sweden never closed its schools, and yet its children got no sicker than those from school closure Finland. There are similar examples in other European countries and Japan, but the argument can sway the other way as well. Not many schools around the world put asymptomatic kids through the uncomfortable nose swab protocols, so the true infection rate is hard to pin down. New science is coming in all the time, and only a few days ago we found out that when we do put the kids through the discomfort of testing, we find that they do in fact carry high levels of the virus. We do not know if they are infectious to other kids, but they do carry the virus as efficiently as adults. Even more importantly, the same American Academy of Pediatrics that issued the pro-opening letter several weeks ago continues with its diligent surveillance work and has issued an August 6th state-level data report of COVID-19 disease in children, which showed a surprising figure of a 90% increase in child cases over 4 weeks between July and early August. Trust me, I had to read that again as well. These were the states affected, the darker the shade, the more cases, with root causes attributed to state reopening and increased testing in children. As such, this is still all very confusing, especially since not all countries opened their schools with the success of Scandinavia. In Israel, where the health authorities are especially vigilant, schools at every level have been affected. Reopened by mid-May at the time of minimal in-country transmission rate, more than 100 schools had been shut by mid-June, and more than 13,000 students and teachers had been sent home to quarantine. What's the difference between Northern Europe and Israel? We simply do not know. In the end, the social needs of children and economic recovery are important until your child comes back home with a fever during a pandemic. I believe we all understand what's at stake here. This is how I see this equation, and I encourage you to take a deep dive into the data as well as your own soul to find which way it sways for you. With information and statistics incomplete, this is more about your personal risk tolerance than about anything else. Besides, remote learning lends itself to a bit of homeschooling, and I can think of no better way to spend the time with your kids than learning the wonders of the natural world together. I feel privileged to have been invited to our district's reopening committee, and I'm proud of our solution of a hybrid model with equal opportunities for in-school and fully remote learning. As the districts around the country continue to come up with their own plans, and as parents weigh pros and cons of sending their kids back to school, I wish us all the best in making the right choice. And yes, do ask your kids what they think. It will be them sitting in that classroom after all.